Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, from wherever you are joining. Welcome to today's session of SecPod webcasts. I'm Jexid, your host. Through SecPod webcasts, we bring you the latest happenings at SecPod and exciting stuff we're working on to prevent cyber attacks for enterprise IT security teams globally. Today is an exciting discussion. I'm really excited for this because I have a panelist that's very dear to us, is one of our ambassadors, and we are really proud to work with him, right? And I'd like to introduce Matthew Fish from Fort Mesa. Matthew, can you please tell us a little bit about ourselves and our viewers, also something about Fort Mesa and what you do?
Yeah. We've been partnered with SecPod for a few years now. Our center of gravity is governance, risk, and compliance, and we work with service providers. And those service providers are delivering cybersecurity all over the world. Security planning workflows that support the sales process to get the right security to the right end customer, project management, and then of course evidencing and proofing. And we partnered with SecPod. One, because the product is really well aligned with the needs of service providers and service delivery, but also because really the data quality is quite high. So super excited to continue working with SecPod, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thanks, Matt. And again, so for everybody, we are here to talk about a very interesting topic. We call it the threat equation, which is what we like to call is vulnerabilities multiplied by exposure, or you can put it the other way: exposed vulnerabilities leading to threats, right? But more important, we are here to talk about and rather hear Matthew's experience and talk about a few topics which are immensely valuable for enterprise IT security teams. Right. So before we begin, I'd like to remind all of us that a recorded version of this webinar will be available on our website and our YouTube channel. We will also send a recording to your email after the session, so you can watch it and share with your colleagues if you want to. For those of you just joining, welcome. Today we're going to talk about a couple of things. Again, we're going to talk about the threat equation to crack the vulnerability exposure problem. And we're going to deep dive into some of those topics that are really interesting for IT security teams in today's world. Then we're going to talk about combating security risks beyond CVEs, which is again an interesting topic that's going on everywhere. It's not CVEs anymore, and we're going to talk about a little bit about that. Then we're also going to cover some of the most important questions asked by IT security teams and leaders. In fact, and very quickly, we're going to also show what SecPod solution has been and hear how Matthew has found value from SecPod. Right? And towards the end of the session, we're going to have a quick Q&A where you can, of course, you can put your questions in the chat window below your BrightTalk player, and we'll cover your questions towards the end of the session. So great. With that, confusion in the industry, Matthew. There's a lot of confusion in the industry, right? There's a lot of technical jargon, and everybody coming up with words they like, right? And words words they want everybody to use, right? Which and in fact, when I go to conferences, when I talk to people, when I talk to my colleagues and peers, there's a lot going on, right? And the questions such as, oh, what's a vulnerability? Everybody has their own definition. What's an exposure? Everybody has their own opinion about it, right? Are they the same? That's part of the confusion that's circling, because there are threat management vendors talking about exposure management. There are vulnerability management vendors talking about exposure management, right? And then how does it differ or different? How is it different from vulnerability management, right? Do you get to hear these in your conversations, and what's your opinion how this should be handled by the industry? Of course, to make sure we're keeping it simple.
Well, I was formally trained in cyber risk management, and so I have the CISSP credential, and when you go through ISC2's Common Body of Knowledge, they say this is exactly what this word means, right?
Mhm.
But then you go and we're in the compliance space, so we're really focused on standards in cybersecurity, and you'll see that in ISO 27K, they have one definition. In NIST 830, they have a different definition. They're roughly equivalent, but they use different words, slightly different exact definitions. And sometimes it depends on whether people are talking about quantified risk and they're trying to calculate scientifically the dollar amount of exposure, as an example, or they're talking more generally, qualitatively, this thing seems like it's exposed or could be exposed more generally. Um, so there's a lot of nuance out there, and in addition to that, of course, we've got marketing departments that get involved that maybe aren't trained in cybersecurity, and some vendors are doing a really awesome job, and some vendors are adding confusion, right? So that's the environment we live in as security professionals. When I think of exposure, I think I think of it's. I love this this icon here, because not only is it showing this idea of two different things colliding. There's two different meanings of the word exposure, right? There's the common English meaning, right? Like, you can see this thing. This thing is exposed, for example, to the weather, for example, to an attacker, right? But also there's the scientific definition, and whether you're in cybersecurity or some other area of risk management, exposure is used in the same way. It's considered the amount of value in your assets that could potentially be impacted,
Mhm.
which is really nebulous. Something could be hidden inside an organization, but if there's a way for an attack to get through, it's still exposed. Um, so I mean, when we have a conversation with an end customer, we have to sort of set those definitions. And I think as an enterprise, having a common agreement, there's not one right definition of these words. Having a common agreement inside your group will help everyone have the same conversation. Certainly in the vulnerability management space, right? We've got vulnerabilities, right, which are the things that threats are taking advantage of, right? And they come in through exploits, right? Um, and it's a pretty easy to understand thing. And if we're going to be having that conversation, it's important to just frame how, in vulnerability management, specifically what an exposure means is that there's some way for a threat to get in there. It's usually an attacker. When we're talking vulnerability management, an attacker could get to it, right? So it's exposed, for example, on the internet, or it's exposed on someone's workstation, or it's exposed because it's via some other way in. So I that's
Yeah.
that's the way I've seen this conversation had, and the
Uh-huh.
confusion, and it's and of course there's lots of other terminology we could throw in there if we wanted to make this more confusing. But I think threats, vulnerability, exposure are great places to start, and everyone should have an understanding of that if they're really going to understand the value of vulnerability
Hmm.
management.
Hmm. Yeah, and interesting, right? Since you talk about that, there's also this. I wouldn't say it's a very fast transformation, but I think it's going on very silently, right? That attack surface management is something that is is really coming to the forefront now, right? It has been happening in the back end. I mean, security teams do a lot of stuff, but yeah, again, as you said, right, putting words into their mouth to define it. That's where I think when we talk about attack surface management, these things start flowing in, and typically enterprises, specifically leaders, would define their strategy either to look at attacks first and then define what were the threats behind these attacks, right? Whether there were threats, known threats already that led to this attack, and of course, if a vulnerability caused it, right? Where they go through this flow. look at attacks, threats, and then vulnerabilities, right? And then there's another strategy where, okay, proactively we're going to look at all the vulnerabilities, irrespective whether somebody can attack or not, right? Then we're going to focus on what is the risk, calculate the risk with those vulnerabilities, and then define what risk of that, what portion of that risk is adding to the attack surface. Right, but both of these strategies collide, have an overlap, as you rightly pointed out. Right, is the exposure, what is actually exposed, needs to be also highlighted. Right, if and there's an endless debate whether or not all vulnerabilities should be prioritized, whether or not all vulnerabilities must be fixed or not. Right, but I think, like you pointed, exposure is what should be prioritized, right? Uh, uh, whether you look at it from the attack view or the vulnerability view, uh, the exposure is what would help put things into right perspective. So I think, yeah, bringing that back here, since we are trying to simplify what we have tried to do as part of SecPod, right? Being part of our responsibility is also to make sure we are not complicating it either. We are making it simpler for everybody else, right? So how we like to put it is, vulnerability is a weakness. Every attacker uses a weakness, some kind of a weakness, right? It could be technical or human related, right? And then how we like to look at that, look at it is when a security team is trying to define what could be a threat, it could be what exposed vulnerabilities, uh, right? And that is where you they can also go ahead and calculate the risk associated with those threats, or rather, probability of a threat could be defined as something that could be risky and adding to the attack surface. So you are a lot more expert in this field, Matthew. I mean, I'm pretty sure our audience would love to hear your perspective in defining, making the equations right. And
we have our own way of trying to reduce this down in Fort Mesa, the complexity. But I'll tell you, if you take it out of the textbook, there's 20 different variables that need to get plugged into a quantified risk formula, right? And they all get rolled up. And sometimes we don't even use the word probability. We use the word, for example, likelihood. It basically means the same thing. I think a lot of that terminology adds unnecessary confusion. I love the idea of rolling it up to something this simple and just say, look, the risk that the organization has, right, is the likelihood that that threat is going to exploit a vulnerability, via an exposed asset, right? And then it's going to create some kind of damage, and you could do this in math, but to actually impact your organization and get your organization to a safer place, or to a place that feels like an acceptable level of risk, right? You satisfied your risk appetite at the right level. I don't think you need to use math to calculate dollars and complicated scoring. I think if you're shining a light around your organization and you're looking for vulnerabilities and you're prioritizing that based on the criticality of the vulnerability, the importance of the business asset, and then if you look a little bit closer into the surface and say, well, this thing is directly on the internet, clearly we need to clean that up. This thing's directly behind that, right? Or you could look and say, hey, this thing's directly on an end user machine, and that end user has access to whatever they have access to. Those give you ways to prioritize all of this and triage and move forward. But I think all of these concepts are required to do that, to go through that exercise. And I know that the data we use, that SecPod gathers for us, right, is essential in getting ground truthing the technical reality. But then you got to work with your business units, and you got to work with the systems that drive your organization to understand the rest of the risk equation. And that's a bit of a human process. and it allows you to really prioritize where the remediation or management action happens.
Mm, mm. And since you brought that up, that was my next question, right? The data quality. Can you share a little bit more with the audience? What would you advise the audience to define maybe the quality standards they must have for the data that they have at their disposal, right? While when they're trying to come up with these equations or simplify their own security posture.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at overall enterprise risk, there are other types of problems you need to find. But one of the great things about CVEs, so that's common vulnerability enumeration, these vulnerabilities that have specific IDs, the U.S. National Vulnerability Database keeps the repository. They're really great because researchers have done a lot of research on these vulnerabilities, and they say exactly how important they are, right? There are some other types of findings you may have in an organization, but they may be specific to your organization. They may require customized research. They may require people that understand how to stare at source code and draw some kind of security conclusion from that. So CVEs are really neat because people have already done the research. And what's really great about SecPod is in terms of coverage of the global database of CVEs, the vast majority of, I think it's close to, I think we're above 230,000 vulnerabilities now, I believe, out
Yeah,
there,
that's right.
known in the wild and indexed. SecPod's got some of the best data out there from the perspective of being able to actually find those vulnerabilities. I'm not very knowledgeable about the deep recesses of your company history, but I understand you guys date back from a time before 2016 when and you were there on the ground when and some of our viewers may not know this. It used to be that vulnerability data was freely open and around the world, and this was when the security community was smaller. As the security community grew up, there needed to be more business models around how do we incentivize large teams to contribute this knowledge to the world. And so there needed to be an economic model. And because of that, the data is no longer completely open source. And I understand you guys are able to aggregate that data from a lot of different places. And because of that, the data quality that's coming from your database and your tooling is higher than some other products. I usually tell people that it's top tier data quality along with some of the other industry leaders, but there are many vendors in vulnerability management that don't have that quality of data. And I always point this out. And it's easy to see in A/B testing. If you scan with this product, you scan with that product. It's easy to see that the SecPod data is a lot more thorough. And I think this is really important because if you're gonna use the lowest cost action in your organization, you're gonna sit down, you're gonna do some management work, you're gonna try to cut risk in your organization. You want the best data to start with, because if you don't have the best data, you're gonna spend a lot of human time on things that may not matter, right? So I mean, I think the data quality is essential. It's why we're in the SecPod camp and we're cheering you along. And it's why we're happy to tell other people the same thing.
Yeah, like I said, you're one of our ambassadors, and we go way before 2016. We were actually doing this since 2009, and we do this for some of the leading security companies, right? We also provide them the intelligence that they would use in there. But yeah, thanks for that, Matthew. That's a really good perspective, right? So data quality will definitely define how well can an IT and security team manage their attack surface, rather reduce, right? So, and like you pointed out, there is one more thing that needs to be talked about is when we think of CVEs or the vulnerabilities, right? Usually we think of them in terms of CVEs, but that's not enough anymore. There's a lot of unexplored risk or unexposed rather risk, right? Which is risk of risks due to misconfigurations, posture anomalies, missing patches, asset exposures, right? A lot of other things which is hidden. And from our research, what we found is when we're trying to define the vulnerability landscape in order to come up with a good assessment of the attack surface, uh, just 56% of that whole surface area, right, is defined by software vulnerabilities. Rest of it is due to what is not being looked at today, right? And what we've seen is some of the leading scanning tools, they don't prioritize these for IT security teams, which we also believe should change since the attack surface is changing. The view or the perspective of IT security teams must also uh, adapt to that change, right? And to add to that, we do have some of the data that is coming out from research done by ESG Group, and then our own polls that we do on our channels, right? And in our research, which is indicating that IT security teams are not just worried about CVEs anymore, right? They would like to also do a good job in exposing other risks, which goes beyond CVEs. And we've seen a sizable number, a sizable audience that talks about anomalies and exposures, not just vulnerabilities and misconfigurations anymore, right? Have you do you see this discussion, or rather, how do you see this discussion happening in your community? I know everybody's talking about it, but yeah, there could be multiple
I,
versions of it, right? How do you hear about this?
I like looking at these statistics, but they're interesting to me and I want to get lost. But can we go back to the iceberg for a moment? Because I love this picture. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
I want to help define what we're talking about here in terms of misconfigurations or posturing anomalies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we don't need to touch missing patches too much. I think our audience, they understand missing patches. That's been a problem for decades. And it's always something that needs support. And SecPod's a great support tool for that. And I think one of the best things about your patch management solution is the number of products, right? The breadth of the ability to patch is really helpful. But it's not a complex concept, right? Patch all the things you can, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Misconfigurations, I think before we talk about misconfigurations, we should talk about configurations, right? So what we're talking about here, this is a security term, which people use this term in technology space, but it has a very specific meaning in the security space. When we talk about configuration or misconfiguration, we're talking about those settings checkboxes and value checkboxes all over your configuration files, all over your management panes. It's on your applications, it's on your operating systems, it's in your network firewalls, right? What is a secure configuration, right? And what is an insecure configuration? And before we can decide what's misconfigured, we have to decide what's properly configured. And I in my IT career, I spent the first half of my IT career where we used this term security best practice, which was a funny term because what security best practice meant was whatever the engineer that was configuring the thing thought the right settings should be, right? Which not every engineer understands every configuration setting, what the importance of it is and how it relates to others or to the overall security castle you're trying to build, right? And things need to be aligned across the board to be secure. If like attackers are persistent, they're gonna go around your security castle, and if they find one unlocked window, that's the one they're gonna come in, right?
Absolutely.
So back when Active Directory was the primary way to manage Windows, we had group policy objects that could push policies out onto machines. And anyone that has spent time doing that type of thing can tell you those group policy objects do not always work the way you expect. They're not always predictable. They can be overridden. They're not always applied correctly. And even if they are applied correctly, creating the group policy objects is really difficult. not only has that gotten worse, but Active Directory is no longer the only tool to configure endpoints. We now have Mac OS, we've got Chrome OS, we've got Windows, we've got other operating systems like Linux, and then we have cloud-connected endpoints. We have endpoints that are controlled by mobile device management software, by their EDR or MDR software. So there's all these different tools to control endpoints, and making a sense of this setting should be turned on, this setting should be turned off is very, very, very complicated. And because of that, because it's so complicated, it's an area that was really overlooked by the security community. However, attackers have gotten smarter, and people are better at patching vulnerabilities than they ever were before. And so now, as of the Verizon breach report that came out over the last 12 months, what we see is the most common way people get in is the most common way that an organization experiences a loss. It might involve a vulnerability, but the most common threat problem is that user accounts are misused at some point in that action. Now, if an attacker gets a hold of one of your users, don't you want to know that even if that account is compromised, that you've got secure configurations containing the problem, and then of course that you've patched around the user, you've resolved the vulnerabilities around that user so that that attacker can't use lateral movement, or they can't use escalation of privilege to move around systems, right? So the configuration management, which is the security term for this, is super important now. It's more important than it ever was before. But to actually act on secure configurations, you have to have a tool that can go on to all of your endpoints, wherever they are, and get really deep into those security settings. And as anyone who's used like the Azure AD tools recently, or some of the MDM tools may know, there's not that many switches to flip in those interfaces. You know, a lot of these secure settings need to be, you need a special tool on that endpoint to really get the system to a secure place. So super important right now. I'm happy to be working with SecPod on that. The posturing anomalies, we don't need to talk too much about that, but what we're talking about is just understanding that, hey, is that machine as secure as it should be before it interacts with our systems, right? And this is the core of zero trust, which is so important right now, that endpoints should not be accessing your business applications if the posturing is not where it should be, right? So being able to have anomaly detection there, to look and say, hey, this user's workstation is not configured the way it should be, or it's not in the state that it should be in. We need to get that off the network, or we need to do something about it. These are critical things, and I wanted to take time to go into the why, right? Because it's super important. But the numbers are great too. Maybe we could go back to the numbers now and look at.
No. But thanks for the perspective, right? That's really important to mention. That when you're looking at things, it's really important to know the why it's important before we start executing. And part of the reason, Matthew, these things, my personal belief is that they don't get, they're not successful because they're not talked well enough, right? Like you do. And as soon as it gets starts getting complicated, we like to run away from those, right? Let's fix what we can fix, and then let's talk about the difficult stuff later. But yes, like you pointed out, it's really important to talk about it right now. Be it zero trust, be it getting good control over cyber attacks, right? And I think even, and I've talked to some really good friends of mine, right? And they all have the same opinion. More technology doesn't mean more security anymore, right? So you need to be going into the why of doing stuff, and then be very clear about that. And again, thanks for that perspective, right? So some of the important questions that we get asked from IT security teams: how do we manage the rising number of vulnerabilities and exposure? And I believe, I mean, you already have talked about some part of it, but we'd love to hear your opinion about this, right? How can I overcome limited, low quality data points vulnerability intelligence feed? How can we effectively reduce the attack surface? How do you prevent cyber attacks effectively? I know from my perspective, there's one answer that's too simple. Work with SecPod, but that's not the answer I would like to give. But
Well,
your opinion.
okay. So first of all, I want to preface by saying I sell software for a living. Okay. So we're a software company, right? But we work with security service organizations. And let me tell you, none of those security services organizations are successful without their people. And I don't think enterprises are in the same situation. You can have the best tools, but if your people don't use them effectively, you're not going to have a great outcome. So, and I personally believe that cybersecurity overall, the overall space of cybersecurity is 2/3 people and process. So you need the data collection tools, you need the remediation tools, and then you need to make sure your people are using them effectively. So as we think about how do we do this thing, how do we prioritize? There's tools that people might want to pair up, like prioritization concepts, right? That people might want to pair up with the data collected by a vulnerability sensor or a management tool. People should be collecting data on their business operations. They should understand what is the impact of a problem in this part of the business versus that part of the business. I don't want to be over reliant on that as a security professional, because an attacker gets in one place and they move around, right? So you do need to consider every place, the exposure risk of every place. But knowing what the business values is super important. Not only does it tell you where to focus your security efforts, but it tells you how to communicate back to the business owners and say, you know what, we've got this problem over here, and we might need resourcing to resolve that. We might need a new thing. We might need a new person. We might need a project over here because you have this business asset over here, and it could be impacted through this. And if you don't have that map of the business, you're not going to be able to explain that to the end customer. So I love to have a working picture of the business value, business processes that needs to make its way into this process so you can prioritize and communicate back to the stakeholder when there's residual risk. There's things that are not fixed. So that's one thing. If we want to get super geeky, I want to tell people about the CISA list, which is a list of vulnerabilities known by the US government to be in the use in the wild right now today. Those are things you should be concerned about. It's not a very difficult list because it's only a few hundred vulnerabilities. And if you have that someplace, you can compare that with what you're finding in your actual environment. And you could say, look, this thing's in the wild right now today. It's an absolute priority that we do this thing, right? Of course, you could also look at the criticality of the vulnerabilities with the CVSS scores. 9 and above are considered critical, high priority to get those. Then there's high priority, which is 7 to 9. Those are also important. But it's worth noting that attackers sometimes do backflips off of a CVE that's rated at a 2 or a 3, and then they get some, piece of foothold in a system, and then they use another vulnerability, and they'll use what are called exploit chains. So while those wiping out those higher criticality vulnerabilities will stop those chains, they will break those chains. It's also worth noting those lower priority vulnerabilities can also be eliminated to break those chains. And then the last tool I want to throw out there, because I'm a member of the working group, is the EPSS scoring system, which is super new right now. And it's making a lot of waves, and that predicts the likelihood that an exploit will be leveraged in the wild soon, right? Which is if you really want to be maximizing all possible risk remediation, you'll be looking at the vulnerabilities, and this is an advanced concept, right? To look at what's important next month, because I've already done everything that's important right now. So I love looking at those tools. And I think that's the focus of what I tell people to look at, when they're putting those people processes in place in concert with the tooling.
Fantastic. I love that idea, right? Humans, don't forget the humans, they're the top of the chain, right? Technology can never overrule. Technology is a tool. My takeaways, CISA's KEV, implement that as well. And then start reading up about EPSS, right? Along with CVSS. Thanks, Matt. That's really insightful. Right. So I think so. So fundamentally, just if we talk about all of these from another scope, what we get to usually do is define the broader scope. Like you said, the strategy should be in place, and humans should be leading that space, right? It should not be all tools and technologies, but humans need to drive the strategy. And of course, integration and automation are some of the keys, right? Today, integration from a perspective that even if you have multiple tools in your environment, they all need to be integrated, because you do not want your data at 10 different places and then making sense of all of that data to cook up a story, right? No more cooking. Uh, and the integration is what keeps it simple. And like you said, you should be able to go across the spectrum and look at multiple things, set up a chain of events properly, so you have visibility into that. And that's where integration plays a huge role. And how fast can an action be taken? That's where automation comes in. Right. So this aligns very well, and that's where we at SecPod also have we are leading this thought of continuous vulnerability and exposure management, right? Where across your IT infra, be it on cloud, be it the network, the devices, the identity, the apps and data, right? There has to be a continuous vulnerability and exposure management done on the entire infra, which would mean looking at vulnerabilities, and then what are the exposures, and then defining is there a threat or not, right? And then coming up with a really good attack surface definition of the attack surface to be able to then go ahead and start remediating, right? Of course, there's a huge role that prioritization has to play, because uh, you can't just keep fixing everything at one time, right? And like you said, the advanced systems, scoring systems such as EPSS is going to create is going to drive a huge impact uh, in this area, right? Which would help, not just help prioritize remediation, but what should I then start thinking of the next month or the month after, right? Be able to predict, and that's, I think, what we would truly call staying ahead of cyber attackers, right? How do you like to see this, Matt? I know you've already shared some of it in the past, but do you see this uh, um playing an important role in the next few years?
Well, so I think you mentioned a couple of things I'd love to drill into. Um,
Mhm,
One of the things is I'm going to start at the bottom here because it's one of my
mhm,
pieces here. That the need to continuously assess, right? Um, some history here. 20 years ago, only a very small percentage of companies had vulnerability management. It was exceedingly small. Even today, I think we've got a lot of ground to make up in the industry. There's a lot of people that are not yet doing vulnerability management or scanning of any type. But for most of the
True.
last 20 years, an annual scan was best practice. And thanks to the payment card industry and PCI DSS, there was movement towards quarterly scans, and that happened about 10 years ago. Um,
Mhm, mhm,
but today, what's best practice is continuous. And so what's expected by security standards, and this is standards from all over the planet. It's not just one standard. Most of the standards are very aligned on this, but it's also the cybersecurity insurance industry. What they are all saying is, if it's possible to scan for a vulnerability, the expectation is that you've scanned for it, you've found the vulnerability, you've triaged it according to some kind of risk methodology, and any methodology your organization wants to come up with that's reasonable, it is acceptable, right? You've done the triage, and then you've done some type of management action on that. And management is you've remediated it with a patch or a config change, or you've eliminated the asset, you've uninstalled something, you've retired a device, or you've put a risk accept in, right? Someone on the business side of the house, not in the technology team, on the business side of the organization. And if you guys are all mapping business processes and who's in charge of what in your organization, you're going to know who's in charge of that asset, right? You're going to know who paid for it, who could release dollars to maybe get a better version of something, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have that. That person is responsible for doing the risk accept. And you have to do all of that. Most of the standards say 14 days. So some of the standards say 30. This is way, way different than just a few years ago where 90 days felt pretty good. Now, I've heard anecdotally this year that insurance carriers have gone a little further. We have a bunch of partners in the insurance industry, and they're telling us what's happening right now. And what's happening right now is, if it's possible to find a vulnerability and it's possible to patch that vulnerability, if you haven't done it and there's a loss, you're going to get a deny claim.
Wow.
So big deal. And so to do any of that, you have to be scanning continuously. You can't do this monthly, quarterly, annually. You have to scan every day. And maybe you don't need to start your management process over. The people don't need to necessarily be staring at that panel every day. But yeah, once every week or two, it is essential that it's someone's job to go in there and look and see what's changed, what's new, what do we need to do right now. And that's essential. And so super, super important. So to say that you guys do it continuously, I just want to emphasize how important that continuous is. In addition to that, the assessment, the reason we assess cybersecurity is not usually to give the technology team advice. It's useful to give the technology team advice, and it's helpful, and it helps them do their job. But it's not the technology team's job to decide how secure something should be. It's the business's job to decide how secure they want to be. So the purpose of the assessment is to tell the business, whoever owns the business, whoever's in charge of the business management organization, this is where your security is right now. This is an idea of where you might want to be. This is what it would take to get there. Do you feel good about your current resourcing? And that gives the business the opportunity to say, I feel great about what's happening. Keep it up, team. Or, hey, team, it looks like you could use more resources, right? And that is essential. And I just want to point that out as well. So it's great that once you've done that, we now have the SecPod tooling, right? That then makes it super simple for the team actually to do the work, right? When the enterprise says, oh, well, we just need to be 10 feet higher, or we want to do 20% better, right? There's a very clear mechanism to do that. And you guys have a pretty full life cycle solution, all the tools that would be required to really invest in that process.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's how we have put it together, right? The technology around to make sure IT security teams are able to implement the technology that we preach, right? So visibility, normalization, ability to continuously prioritize, and then not another tool for remediation. The same platform must be able to remediate those, and then a technical report, a practical report for the business, a technical report for practitioners, right? So that everybody's on the same page. That's what we call the continuous vulnerability and exposure management platform. SanerNow is how we call it today. And really important to highlight, and like you did, Matt, is continuity is the primary pillar, right? And as Matt talked about some of the key changes in the industry, if we are able to detect something and remediate, it must be done, right? There's no option, at least how I see it in the coming few years, right? There is not going to be an option left. It is going to be a must, right? As long as you have the ability to do it, right? And that's how we make sure we bring this technology to IT security teams, right? Where continuity, integration, automation are the three key pillars in order to prevent something from happening, right? And that is also being implemented by enterprises within their infra in this format, right? So we have the technology segmented into 7 tools on the on one single platform that works with one single agent running on the device. Now we do have the capability to also do agentless, where you can have just one agent configured as a network scanner, right? Or just externally, it should be able to authenticate into systems and perform those scans. But fundamentally, visualization, normalization, then detection and prioritization, and finally remediation and mitigation are the three major use cases that we help IT security teams implement very well. And again, keep it modular. They can start as they want to. If somebody just wants to start mitigating or remediating the risk that they already have assessed or detected, they can just do that. Or if somebody wants to just detect and prioritize and then have their own remediation tools fixing it, that can be done. Or somebody wants to end-to-end implementation, where they would have visibility, ability to normalize, ability to detect and prioritize, and then ability to also remediate and report. All of that can be done, right? So that's what we offer today, and our successful customers use. And I would also invite Matt to for you to share a couple of maybe experiences or how you have seen the value of the technology that SecPod offers today.
Yeah, I mean, I think asset exposure and vulnerability management is the place to start. It allows you to find all the assets where they are. It allows you to identify vulnerabilities. It's from a people perspective, the amount of effort to put into those things is the lowest amount of effort. Now, vulnerability management on its own is it's an oversight tool. It gives you oversight on how the rest of your systems are operating from the perspective of what vulnerabilities are out there, right? So once you've done that, right, you would then want to proceed into risk prioritization of some type, and you may need patch management. It's super, super common that people think they're doing a good job on patch management because they have a patch management tool. Come to find out, their patch management tool patches 10 products, but they actually have 100 products in their environment, right? So if your patch management tool is not, if it's not performing to the extent that it needs to perform, there's an easy solution here, right? So I love to see people proceed down that direction. And then, once you have those things rolling in a continuous process, remember what we're talking about. You need to scan every day. People need to be on top of these processes. Once you reach operational effectiveness there, the compliance management stuff would be the next area to look at. And I think it's reasonable for an organization that really wants to get their security to the next level that you would touch all of these things over a 12-month period, even starting from zero, right? I think that you can do a really good initial surveillance in a few weeks with vulnerability management, asset management. You can get a good look at the risk, and then you can understand, well, what needs to be patched and how is our patching performing and what's the opportunity for patch management, and then to circle back on the compliance management anomaly, posturing stuff. Really, be in the first half of a year, right? And then to continue to increase your people's operational effectiveness through the end of the year. I think you can make a huge impact and getting your organization up to that next level, it's just super important because the attackers aren't standing still. Their practices are improving every day, and if yours are not as well, then they're just going to overtake you. So
absolutely, and there are enough news now, right, where large corporations getting attacked by teenagers. So it's not a myth anymore. It's happening in the real world.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that brings. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Well, I want to comment on the teenagers thing because people may not be too afraid of teenagers, but they should be, because it's not just a teenager that's pulling off an attack. The teenagers who may not be aware of the risk they're taking on to their future life, right, are accessing tools available on the dark web that are built by literally hundreds of the smartest people in cybercrime, right, that then make these tools available to teenagers. And it's way scarier than some kid with too much time on their hand, right? It's actually some kid that has no idea what they're doing to the world, right?
Oh yeah.
They don't understand the impact they're having, and they're taking advantage of dangerous state-level complexity cyber weaponry, right, and firing it randomly around the internet. And that's I don't want people to, like, you should be scared of teenagers. So
for sure. I mean, and it's like you said, right? It's more dangerous, and the way it's panning out, I think it's much more important for people to prioritize, specifically enterprise security teams now, right? That an attack can come from anywhere. It could be just a kid that you may think is harmless, but that's not the case anymore. Right? That
we got a pile of questions here.
Oh yeah. We have so a quick time check, right? So we have 5 minutes. I think we can take 5 minutes for questions, and then of course, I mean, I would love to hear a good if there's any closing statement that you have, Matt, for our audience. And so far, I've loved the conversation, right? Keep it human centric. Though make sure you have a method to the madness and make sense of data in a specific way. So we have a couple of questions. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I want to cover this cloud question. So we've got a question about distributed or hybrid architectures, right? Where you've got cloud there, points there, people take their devices home. Yeah, I mean the clouds have security tools built in them. They're not all comprehensive, and some of them go deeper than others. But I think there's a lot of value in getting. People are afraid of agents sometimes. They're like, oh, not another agent. But the reality is, in our distributed technology environment these days, you need to get agents onto the endpoints that are accessing company systems. And your agents need to fill all of the security functions. So you need vulnerability management wherever your endpoints are. You need patch management wherever your endpoints are. You cannot rely on centralized systems for that. You need agents to do those things. And by using the same agent everywhere, you'll make your job easier. So that was one question. And then
there was.
Where do you want to go here next?
So we've talked about this, I think, but there's another version, right? Although humans constitute the majority of the strategy in cybersecurity, but there's another perspective where human link is the weakest in cybersecurity chain that gets talked a lot about, right? Especially phishing attacks targeting human elements, right? How would you accommodate that in the threat equation is the question.
Well, our industry has done a really good job of convincing the world they should be training And that's true. But the reality is humans are always going to fail. Machines are always going to fail too, right? But I think everyone listening knows that teams of people can generally do better jobs than individual humans. And so what's important is that you have a culture of security and working together towards a goal, and you have processes in place to work together so that anyone can fail and the security machine still wins. And so that's just it's critically important to put those processes in place. And if you have questions about, well, what are those processes, you would look to the standards. They're pretty clear on that.
Perfect. Rightly put, right? And then there's another question that you said during the talk. Best practices used to be 90 days scanning, then 30, and you see it becoming more continuous. And by when do you see organizations embracing the continuous approach? I know you've already talked about this, but I think this is more of a repeated
I can make
question.
it super easy. It's the next time you try to renew your insurance policy, or the next time you try to claim on an insurance policy, organizations are going to have to wake up at that moment. So if you think either of those things are in your future, you should do it before those things happen. That's the biggest driver right now. But then, of course, the standards organizations, governments are pushing as well.
Absolutely. Does asset inventory play any role in continuous vulnerability and exposure management? And I think you've talked about this, right? Discovering assets and keep making sure we have a profile, and then exposure management and vulnerability management. But I'll let you take this up.
So they are two different things, right? Finding the vulnerabilities and finding the assets are different things. And I don't want to be confusing, but to fulfill the security function, you have to do both together. It's not optional to just do one, unless you have a perfect inventory list already, which you may, because if you're doing your job in asset management already, you may already have a perfect asset list, but most people don't. And you need to scan for assets because you need to know what exists. What are you defending? You can't defend assets if you don't even know they're there. Or if you know that they're there, but you don't have data on exactly what they are, because when you look for vulnerabilities, you need to make sure you're getting that vulnerability data from everything you expect to be getting it from. And so those two things go together. And I think you can use separate tools for these things, but it's not optional. You can't just do one of them. If you're only doing one of them, you're not doing it right. So.
Yeah. Right. It has to be integrated. It has to go hand in hand. How did the KPIs of security teams have changed? How have they changed in 2024? Do you have a perspective on that, Matt?
Oh, this is a deep hole. We could spend like half a day on this, but the whole security industry is working on this. How do you measure the effectiveness of security? And I think, again, I'm going to say go look at the standards. The first thing you do should be to figure out how much security you have and how much you need. The second thing you should be doing is remediating to the point of what security you need, making sure you get it in place. And usually you'll look at a control matrix for this from some security standard. I don't care which one. They're all good these days. And then once you have that security in place, you should measure and make sure it's working. And there's different metrics for each of these. But I'll tell you the measure that I think is most important, and it's velocity. How fast is your team moving? How many vulnerabilities are you guys managing, right? How many posture problems are you managing? And I don't count the automated stuff. I want to know how your people are doing. And so that's the thing that I look at. And the people, of course, need good tools to do their job. But I want to know what are the people doing? Are they deploying new things? Are they making changes, et cetera? That's super important.
Perfect. I think we have a final question. Your views on how to perform external surface management for an organization.
So this is somewhat of a controversial topic because there's vendors out there whose whole business is external attack surface management, and they think they have a pretty good solution. Personally, I don't believe in that. I think the right solution is to look at what are your vulnerabilities or weaknesses everywhere, do that first. And then once you have that whole space, look at it and say, this is outside. This is external. I don't think you can look from the outside. You need to look from the inside. So
fantastic, amazing, and of course, to our audience, if you still have any other questions, you can always shoot out them to us through our social channels, write an email to us at info@secpod.com, and we'll make sure we get an answer for you from Matthew. Right, Matthew, that was lovely. I think we're on time. Lovely talk. Lot of insights. I would recommend everybody to watch this even after this, right? And of course, like you said, there are a lot of discussions that need to happen. I'll make sure some of those I would be able to get your time in the future to discuss, right? And any closing thoughts for our audience, Matt?
Well, if you're not currently doing vulnerability management or assessment or posturing management, you need to start. And now is a good time. I think that's it.
Fantastic. No better time than now. So once again, we will send a recorded version of this to your email. It's also going to be available on our website and our YouTube channel, as well as on our Bright Talk channel. Please keep tuned to SecPod webcast. We'll see you on our next session. Thank you for your valuable time. I wish you a happy time ahead. Matt, lovely having you. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.